Committee will come to order. Today we will be considering the 3 bills on government transparency and several postal naming resolutions. Each of 3 bills we will consider today were approved by this committee with bipartisan votes in the past Congress. So I hope you will continue to work cooperatively to move these bills forward. H.R. 1323. I now call up H.R. 1323, Reducing Information Control Designation Act, which was introduced by Representative Steve Drivers. This is a companion bill to H.R. 854, the bill on overclassification that the committee approved last month. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1323 be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, I yield to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Dryhouse, to describe the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this opportunity. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for considering the Reducing Information Control Designations Act. This is a common sense bill that will increase openness and transparency in government. The bill, as was mentioned by the chairman, was introduced by Chairman Waxman in the last session, with primary co-sponsor being Ranking Member Congressman Davis. As both the chairman and ranking member this session have noted, at the start, we share a responsibility to protect the interests of the American people. This committee has already addressed overclassification through H.R. 854, the Overclassification Reduction Act. The legislation I have introduced proposes additional policy enhancements to deal with the issue of overclassification. And just as a point of reference, there are 107 known classifications that currently exist within the federal government. I'm going to repeat that. 107 known classifications within the federal government. H.R. 1323 would require the Archivist of the United States to put in place regulations pertaining to information control designations and ensure that agency heads implement these regulations. This bill would require inspectors general to conduct audits, and it would make training programs available to those with the authority to control information. It is important to note that this legislation promotes a common language to be used within the federal agencies by reducing the number of informational control designations. Ensuring that the American people have access to their government is absolutely essential to our democracy. We all know that highly sensitive information needs to be carefully controlled, but most government information is not sensitive, and it should be readily available to the public and other agencies within the federal government. This legislation moves us toward that goal in a responsible manner. The bill includes no private or intergovernmental mandates, and it will have zero impact on the budgets of state, local, or tribal governments. Mr. Chairman, next week is Sunshine Week, when we take notice of the importance of open government and freedom of information. Moving forward on the Reducing Information Control Designations Act would send a clear signal that this Congress is serious about promoting transparency and openness in government. I thank the Chairman again for allowing this committee to consider this important measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Let me agree with the sponsor that the current system that different agencies are using, various vague and confusing designations to restrict access to unclassified information is just not working. We need a consistent approach that balances the need to restrict some sensitive information with the openness that our democracy requires. This bill finds that balance, and it has my full support, and I encourage the members to do likewise. I yield now to the ranking member of this committee, Mr. Axel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too support 1323. It is a sensible move in the right direction. As all of us in Congress who have received briefings in the past know, we often see open source material with a wrapper that says top secret on top of it. We discover that only the front page or a paragraph has anything other than what you and I can Google ourselves at any time. Moreover, use of terms like sensitive but not classified or for official use only have turned into a not so subtle threat against individuals not simply to release something even though it may be handed to them in a hotel room, in a hotel convention site for a vast group of people to take home on airplanes. We cannot have double standard in our active lives, certainly in our records keeping and material available to the public. These kinds of terms leave an ambiguous mark on what could or should be given to the public. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, the work we do here today serves an extremely important point, which is as we eliminate these ambiguous terms and enforce training that will cause people to be specific that which is classified confidential, secret, top secret, and beyond should be carefully classified. Well, these other terms should be taken out of day-to-day use so that people really know what is available to show to anyone and what is available to put on the website versus that which is, by definition, truly sensitive. So with that, Mr. Chairman, this is a good bipartisan bill. I strongly support it. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Ison. Would any other members like to? Any other members? Are there any amendments? I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 1323 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favor of reporting H.R. 1323 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposes? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the H.R. 1323 is ordered reported. Now we call up H.R. 1320. H.R. 1320, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, amendments of 2009, which was introduced by Representative Nancy Clay, the chair of the Information Policy Subcommittee. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1320 be considered as read and open for amendments at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, I yield to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Clay, to describe the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your expediting committee's action on this vital legislation. When Congress passed the Federal Advisory Committee Act in 1972, its intent was to make Federal Advisory Committee more accountable, transparent, balanced, and independent from the influence of special interests. Somewhere along the way, these important tenets were lost, and appointments to Federal Advisory Committees became rewards to those whose political ideology mirrored that of an administration. In many cases, qualified individuals were excluded from these committees. For example, GAO found that some appointments to scientific and technical advisory committees generated controversy due to the perception that appointments were made based on ideology rather than on expertise, or were weighted to favor one group of stakeholders over another. H.R. 1320 will improve the transparency of advisory committees so that agencies cannot appoint conflicted or biased members in secret. H.R. 1320 strengthens FACA by requiring greater disclosure of timely and acceptable information on advisory committee. The bill requires disclosure of the process by which members to an advisory committee are selected, their names, and any conflicts of interest. H.R. 1320 requires that members be appointed without regard to political affiliation. The bill requires an advisory committee to describe the process by which it considers recommendations and arrive at a conclusion. No longer will committees be allowed to operate in total secrecy. H.R. 1320 also clarifies who is considered a member of an advisory committee. Under this bill, agencies will no longer be able to get around FACA by having participants act like members without being formally appointed. An individual who regularly attends and participates in committee meetings as if he or she is a member will be considered a member, even if that person does not have voting rights or veto power. Finally, H.R. 1320 closes several loopholes that allow agencies to avoid complying with FACA, such as hiring this is a good bill that will make FACA process more transparent and help the federal agency to more effectively administer the process. And I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank you, gentlemen, from St. Louis. The Federal Advisory Committee Act was first enacted to ensure transparency. When the federal government is obtaining advice from outside interests, these amendments restore the original purpose of the act and close several loopholes that have emerged. I urge all the members to support this bill. This is good government. At this time, I now yield to the ranking member of the committee, Congressman Isley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too share your view that the Federal Advisory Committee Act is in fact a good piece of transparency. I will, however, be working to make it just a tad better. As the chairman and many of the members know, we have had one loophole that is not currently closed in this bill, and one might say it's not even a loophole, but rather an ambiguous nature, and that is to the role of the First Lady. As many of you will remember, two presidents ago, First Lady Hillary Clinton played an important role in leading one of the most powerful federal advisory committees ever, highlighted in 1993 that in fact she, seeking to work on health care, did not have at that time what one might consider to be proper guidance. After a prolonged court case, actually a fairly short court case, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia on June 22nd, 1993, ruled that the First Lady was a federal employee, and therefore the Hillary Task Force on National Health Care Reform was allowed to hold meetings in secret without public disclosure. Mr. Chairman, that is true today and will not be different under this First Lady or the next First Lady. As many of us remember more recently, the role of the Vice President and his advisory activities in energy was equally controversial. Mr. Chairman, there's nothing more bipartisan than us looking at all those who serve the executive branch and finding a way to consistently give them the rules of the road that allow them to seek the guidance they need under a consistent set of rules, and to do so as transparently as possible, but if appropriate, in secret. I believe that our amendment tries to do that. I know the chairman has some reservations. I hope that he will accept the amendment today and continue to work for perhaps 2 to 3 weeks, both with the rest of the Congress, the Senate, and most importantly, the new administration, which has asked for transparency. I might note that this is not a new amendment, although I realize it's new to this particular bill. Mr. Davis in the previous Congress had, in fact, outlined in the minority views, which I would ask to include in the record at this time, the fact that this needed to be dealt with even when we didn't know who the next president was going to be. Mr. Chairman, I believe this is open government at its finest. I realize that both sides may have concerns on any language. Would ask us to incorporate this language and then work to perfect it with all parties before it goes to the floor. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other members wish to? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Iser, would you briefly explain to me how your proposed amendment squares with or changes Section 3D of the Act, which says an individual who's not a full-time or permanent part-time officer or employee of the federal government shall be regarded as a member of the committee? What would this amendment do that does not?
What it does is it defines that the First Lady is not an employee specifically. So it takes her out of that role. As you know, we have a separate fund which is set up for the First Lady. She has operating funds to do her duty. However, her role has not historically enjoyed the same. Her role to the executive officer, to the president, enjoys absolute secrecy. However, her role in, such as Eleanor Roosevelt's role in the past, was considered to be an open role, one in which all her activities would be considered to be open.
Thank you.
The gentleman
Yes, I would have an amendment if necessary.
Amendment to HR 1320 offered by Mr. Issa. At the end of section 3, page 8, after line 6, add the following new subsection. F, application of FACA to spouses of the President. Section 4 of the Federal Advisory Committee Act 5 U.S.C. APP is further amended by adding at the end of the following new subsection. F, spouse of the President. A spouse of the President shall not be considered a full-time or part-time officer or employee of the federal government for purposes of determining the applicability of this act.
Gentlemen, 5 minutes to explain the argument.
And I'll be brief because I used my opening statement to measure more of it. Nothing in this amendment would preclude, as I understand it, and if it does, I certainly work with the chairman to correct it, nothing would preclude a special designation by the president at a given time to the first lady, or first man, I guess, in the future, a status of employee. In other words, if in fact there is a specific requirement, commission, or act that an administration in the future wanted to assign to a spouse, this does not say you may not do it. It simply says for purposes of this document, the spouse will be considered not to be an employee. And yes, it does respond to a court decision of many years ago now. The intent is not to preclude an administration from seeking to use a spouse in some role other than the one that is currently funded for the First Lady or the spouse of the President, since those funds are for other than an employee, and the other act with some future commission or activity would be separate. Certainly the First Lady currently enjoys an office that allows her to bring people in, meet with them, and advise the President, which is a different role than this unfortunate, not unfortunate, but this historic one that unfortunately First Lady Hillary Clinton was not properly protected, and it led to what I regret. It led to a period of time in which there was jockeying over her rights and privileges. I hope this would settle the question for now without in any way limiting any First Lady now or in the future from doing the job that the President would want to do. And Chairman, I guess I look back.
Chairman, if I may, speak in opposition to the
Gentlemen, recognize for 5 minutes.
I believe my friend from California, with this amendment, redefining the role of the First Lady, as we have historically known. The First Lady has quite a bit of flexibility in representing this country and representing this government, and I think this amendment pigeonholes her into some clearly defined role. And historically, that has not been the case, as we have known for, I wouldn't want to start here. Let me also caution my friends in California that, as you're probably aware, this president is very guarded about his family. And I think that no matter what your intent is with this amendment, the president may view this as an attack on his wife.
With the gentleman,
And I'm just saying, let's be careful if we want to open up that can of worms. Let's not go in that direction.
with the gentleman,
Yes.
and I appreciate the gentleman's thoughts. One of the reasons I cited Mr. Davis's minority views in the last Congress is, of course, at that time we had no idea who the next First Lady would be, and this was not intended to affect the current First Lady. But I think if the gentleman would agree, we are trying actually to protect the historic role of the First Lady. The only thing that taking her out of being, quote, an employee does is it says there cannot be meetings in secret as part of a, if you will, a task force or a committee, that she would be bound by those rules. And I might suggest that if we continue to have the First Lady as an employee, people would legitimately ask, what other employee responsibilities would she then pick up? Would she be eligible for expulsion? Would she be open to this committee hauling her at any time in front of us because she's an employee working on a task force? You think about all the things we do to employees, we want to preserve her right not to have that happen.
But in reclaiming my time, in response to that, I just think that the role of the First Lady historically and traditionally in this country has been that they've had the flexibility to involve themselves in different aspects of our government, different aspects of policy. And we would be inhibiting that through your amendment. Now, I have one more time without the chairman. I yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman. And I respect the ranking member's position on this. However, I do want to mention that, you know, we had a Republican First Lady for 8 years. The gentleman and his colleagues had an opportunity to raise this issue for 8 years when Mrs. Bush was the spouse. And we heard not a word. And now with the Democratic president and I might also mention that the ranking member, you know, hearkens two other spouses. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt, an activist Democratic spouse of an activist president, and Mrs. Clinton, also outspoken and activist during her husband's presidency. And I just, if we're going to do something like this, and I'm not so sure that we should, as a matter of fact, with the brief notice we've had on this, I would certainly put myself in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I think it would require much more thorough vetting of what this would really involve before we undertake something like this. This is rather an abrupt and I think very quick amendment that I think is unwise at this point. Thank you. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
I think we're talking past each other because the way I looked at this was...
St. Louis.
I'm Susan. The gentleman, thank you.
I continue to yield my friend.
And the gentleman?
I yield.
The gentleman yield? May I claim?
I yield back.
I recognize them for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I think we're talking past each other because, you know, in 35 years of politics, I mean, this makes it quite clear that it's trying to defend the First Lady's or the First Gentleman's right to have that relationship without being triggering a lot of other issues that should only apply to a salaried person. I see this as, I just don't see how this is an affront. It's more of a defense of the privacy and the relationship between the president and his spouse. Yeah.
If it's such a great thing, why didn't the gentleman or any of the Republicans on that side support or present this amendment when they had a Republican First Lady? It's such a good thing.
Well, the gentleman, I'll claim my time. This isn't Democrat or Republican or who's in or who's out. This is a spouse. It should have been out of policy that the relationship between the president and their spouse is different and is not an employee-employer relationship. That's all it says. I don't see this as a partisan issue.
With the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I might point out that the minority views I referred to and had put in the record earlier are from May 15, 2008. That was certainly while Mrs. Laura Bush was First Lady. But I might mention to the gentleman, and in trying to diffuse the situation, we are trying not to open cans of worms. First of all, we have anti-nepotism laws that Congress has passed. So if the First Lady continues to be an employee, is it a violation of the anti-nepotism law? But lastly, and what I hope everyone in regard here, and perhaps we need to get to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for an opinion, this is only a question that comes into play when you're going to have a closed and secret activity, not open to the public, not transparent, not available. Certainly, Eleanor Roosevelt was famous for being very public in what she did, and Laura Bush was very public in what she did. The idea that you would have a closed session to come up with legislative policy is where this issue came up. Now, I'm not trying to dig up Hillary Clinton because I think we've long ago gone past the question of whether or not a First Lady can be used by the President as a good advisor. I think that they should be able to. We're only talking here as to openness in government. And so I hope the majority would agree that if we're doing a bill that's supposed to give us maximum transparency, we would include the First Lady in the transparency. Nothing in this would prohibit her from acting in that role that Mrs. Clinton acted in on behalf of President Clinton. I yield back to the Governor.
In reclaiming my time, I would just say that this was brought up last year, regardless of party affiliation. This is for all future, no matter what their party affiliation is. And again, I just think that we're kind of trying to find fault on whose side is proposing it. And I think that this committee has really been great at getting beyond that. This is strictly at trying to make sure we maintain that the relationship between a husband and wife is not the relationship of employer-employee. Yield back.
Then from Massachusetts.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point I'd like to make is, as the ranking member just pointed out, the purpose of his wanting to propose this is to distinguish the application of the First Lady as an employee or not as protected under this act, vis-a-vis whether it's secret or not. So now we get into the point of who's determining whether the meetings are secret or not. And so first, that's where we're going to get into the whole issue here where we're actually going to subject the first spouse, whomever it may be, to a new law, because by basically not subjecting them to the law for purposes of open meetings, you do subject them to the law for purposes of closed meetings. So you understand what I'm saying? You're basically opening up those issues of whether you can bring them in to subject them to hearings and to questions and to audits and the like. So my feeling is that I think we'd all be better off if we got this fully vetted by some counsel, so as to we really knew what we were all talking about today, rather than us spend the rest of the next few hours talking past one another, like my friend from California, Mr. Bilbray, suggested we were doing. Because knowing enough about legislating, by defining protections here, what you can often be doing is opening up liabilities over here if you define the protections very narrowly. And it may seem on the piece of paper that you're protecting the person, but in reality, by defining the protections in such a way, what you're really doing is exposing the person to a lot greater exposure. So I prefer, Mr. Chairman, if we would, maybe we could hold this over, get it some greater explanation as to what this is about, and maybe we don't have to spend all our time debating it anymore.
Right, let me just give my views and I'll recognize the other members. This amendment singles out the First Lady to say that she is not considered an employee for purposes of firing. Let me say, we've only had this for 1 hour and 59 minutes. We've had this. The amendment singles out, of course, in a situation where I think that we have to be careful and be very cautious about how we move. And this is not the time nor the bill. It is not the place for us to decide whether the First Lady is a federal employee. This is not the way to do that. This amendment is a response, of course, to the Clinton Healthcare Task Force. And of course, you know that's gone through the court system and all that. And in making this determination, the court looked at factors such as the First Lady's role in aiding the President in the performance of his duties, and the fact that the President's spouse is supported by a substantial staff of federal employees. The court found the question of whether the First Lady is a federal employee to be complex. Now, if they found it to be complex, I don't think within an hour and 58 minutes that we can make a decision as to what should happen. I really think that this is something that we should move very cautiously with, and of course, and I think that we require more time and need to be vetted more. This is something that we should approach with greater deliberation than we can provide this day. And I'm willing to support my colleague to address any legitimate concerns he may have, but I must urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, because this amendment, sometimes, we do things and do them in haste, and we create serious problems. So I would suggest that we stop and hold off and take a look at this further before moving forward with it. So I'd be delighted to recommend.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with everything you said, and I certainly agree with my friend Mr. Kennedy from Massachusetts. I'm sorry, Rhode Island. Sorry, I hate to do that to you. Sorry, Patrick.
2 days I've heard that.
Patrick, you pick a state, I'm there for you. All kidding aside, I think Mr. Kennedy really did hit on something. I'm not positive that this is the best perfecting amendment. I'm equally willing to define the First Lady as a federal employee at all times. I'm not sure that would be accepted well by a majority. It is perhaps much better that we take a week or two, seek professionals that we can both rely on, and come up with the best decision as to when the First Lady is in fact a federal employee, when she isn't. Perhaps a way to say she isn't unless the President designates and allows for a reasonable designation. I have no intention on digging up, if you will, Hillary healthcare task force as an example. I think it simply made us aware that we needed to define that role in a way that was fair to the First Lady and the President. I'm perfectly willing to modify this thing at a future time, withdraw it today, modify it to meet a mutually agreeable amendment. We could bring us a manager's amendment that would be precisely what every First Lady and President would like to have going forward. And with that, I thank you, Joe.
I yield to the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the ranking member for understanding that this amendment is not appropriate in this bill. If we're talking about employees and who should be an employee, that needs to be a standalone bill where we can talk about who is an employee and who's not. Because as a federal employee, certain benefits accrue to you. If you're not an employee, there's certain places you cannot go, identification, there are a whole lot of other issues. And I think to amend this bill is the wrong and inappropriate place to deal with this issue. So I appreciate your understanding, and if you want to look into the role of the spouse of the President as an employee or not an employee, I think that needs to be handled separately. I appreciate your understanding. We're not ready to accept an amendment, as I am hearing from my colleagues, to this bill at this time. I think it would take far more information as to the status of employee or non-employee for the spouse of the President. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, gentlewoman from California. Now you, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Mr. Issa for his willingness to withdraw the amendment at this time. I just wanted to plead for the value of creative ambiguity. The fact of the matter is, since 1793, this republic has managed somehow to allow the first spouse to remain undefined in statute. And there's been value in it. All first ladies have served remarkable roles in wartime and in peace. When Congress has perhaps unduly interfered in that role, we've had to have presidents actually intervene. President Lincoln had to come to Congress and ask Congress to beg off on an investigation of his spouse during the middle of the Civil War because of unfounded accusations about her so-called Southern sympathies because she was of where she was from. I don't think Congress does itself proud in interfering in that relationship. I think the Republic has benefited from spousal relationships in the White House, and I think we should let it alone. So at least speaking for this member, I will have to hear a compelling case for why the Congress, after over 200 years, should suddenly resort to a statutory circumspection of the role of the first spouse moving forward.
Would the gentleman yield?
Gladly.
I'd like to answer your question because I think it's a good one. What we're doing is simply saying, for purposes of this act, we either choose to say she is a federal employee or say she isn't, and then know what the consequences are. And we're really only acting in reaction to an appellate court decision that settled a question back in 1993, something that now not departed, but just no longer Congressman Tom Davis had made very clear in the last Congress needed to be dealt with regardless of who the First Lady was. You understand that if the First Lady is a federal employee, then this committee has all kinds, and she's been determined by previous courts, we have all kinds of responsibilities to deal with other questions about First Lady. Remembering that over the years, long after Abe Lincoln, we have decided to give money, not give money, set up an office of the First Lady. So we have, as a Congress, changed the role of First Lady. I'm not trying to change the role. I'm happy with any definition that comes out, but ambiguity in that you have to go to the court every time to decide whether an act applies or not is not good creative ambiguity.
I appreciate, for claiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the point being made by the ranking member, but again, I would just say, I think what you're hearing is a lot of skepticism from your colleagues on this side of the aisle as to the necessity of statutory remedy. And if the ranking member wants to make a case, I welcome getting the information. I also would caution that with a new president, just recently inaugurated, the perception, as several of my colleagues have mentioned, is that this looks unduly partisan. And I know that's not the intention of the ranking member. And therefore, I applaud the wisdom of his withdrawing this amendment at this time, and would hope that we would have more information provided to us before we see it again. I'm happy to yield to Mr. Lynch.
Just in reinforcing my colleague's point, I just want to point out that we are considering the status of individuals under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. There is a section E, just before the gentleman's amendment, that defines or delineates the fact that a special employee or appointment to a Federal Advisory Committee, of which we have thousands, that will not make them a quote, full-time or part-time employee. So we are actually in this act and in these sections defining the status of people who are appointed to advisory committees. What the gentleman is attempting to do by the amendment is saying, okay, the First Lady, by the fact that she is married to the President, her status is now going to be affected by this amendment. It is incongruous, and I think outside the mandate of the original act, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, to try to change the status of the spouse of the President. And I agree with Ms. Watson that if we're going to affect the status of the spouse of the President, we ought to do that with all due consideration to every aspect of that position and the vulnerabilities that brings in. What we're trying to do in this act is really identify special positions that are brought in as an advisory position within these advisory committees. And there are, as the Act originally states, there are thousands of committees, boards, commissions, councils, and similar groups which have been established to advise officers and agencies in the executive branch of the federal government. That's what the Act is getting at. And what the gentleman is doing is ignoring that and saying, oh, but we have, at this point, we have the First Lady. And she has some, undoubted influence on the President. And we're going to try to regulate that within the contours of this Act, and I think it is wrong-headed. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. The time has expired. And now yield to the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me go back to what you said. your statement was absolutely brilliant, and and basically what you, and when I combine what you said with what the ranking member said, it convinces me that this is not an issue for us to address today. The ranking member has made it clear that apparently there are significant ramifications to what happens if we were to adopt this amendment. And while he says that it is to protect the First Lady, and I have no reason to doubt that, I seriously want to look and see exactly what it means, for example, with regard to subpoenas. See, I haven't heard that word used yet, but I was here when Travelgate took place, and I saw what went, how folks were subpoenaed, and documents and whatever. It's very interesting. So I don't know what this means. In other words, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it because of that, but at least we need to understand the ramifications. Another very interesting thing is that this is a case that was decided in 1993, as the ranking member and the chairman said. And the chairman, I thank you for quoting the case where they said, the court said, after deliberating, I'm sure, very carefully, that this is a very complex issue. And if a court disposed of it back in 1993, then it may be best if we take some more time. But there's one final point, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes what happens is that, and I've talked about this a lot, how we will make a proposal in hopes that something short of it will prevail. And I don't want to give the impression that I simply are ready to change the law because my distinguished colleague, the ranking member, will bring back something that's less than as far as he wanted to go. I don't want to leave that impression because as far as I'm concerned, I think the 1993 case is fine. And I just think that, again, when we are talking about protection, and I go back to the gentleman's statement from Virginia, what is protection to one person may be just the opposite to another. And I think we have to be careful with that. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to take any more of the committee's time, and I'll yield that.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan.
I have to yield time to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I know we seem to be going around in circles. I don't want to leave the impression that this is not important or that we don't have to determine for this purpose the role of the First Lady based on historic precedents. And I hope the other side will understand my willingness to withdraw and ask us to come back in 2 or 3 weeks after we've all had time to evaluate alternatives is based simply on the fact that I am not proposing today the amendment as the only possible amendment. The truth is we could define that the First Lady is, at all times, an employee and then exempt her from any other considerations that might come from it, and that would take a little bit of language. I'm not saying that. And what I'm saying is that in 1993, and to a certain extent, although a different example, with the Vice President, both parties at times made and Travelgate, as you mentioned, I'd forgotten about that, they made a point of, well, wait a second, can you have these deliberations in secret? Do they have to be open? What are the rules? This is the Committee of Transparency in Government. Therefore, we set the rules as to what is transparent. What are the rules for a meeting, an organization, groups that come together to advise the President? Now, when the Vice President had a meeting with oil executives, I certainly was here, and I heard your side of the aisle complain vigorously. I was not on this committee at the time, but I want to be sympathetic to all the complaints that have come in and said, every single one of them, we should have a set of rules that future presidents, vice presidents, first ladies, spouses of vice presidents understand what their do's and don'ts are. Can they have an open meeting? Can they have a closed meeting? If it's only federal employees in the room, do they have an expectation that that's consultation for and with the president versus if they bring in non-federal employees to advise them, whether they be business leaders, union executives, healthcare professionals, whatever, what is the expectation? Now that is what this committee is supposed to do and do well. This bill does seem to be the appropriate place to define, as to this bill, whether or not other persons, and I may have been insufficient in only naming the First Lady, but other persons shall be defined either as a federal employee if they act this way, or not a federal employee. So, Mr. Chairman, although I'm willing to have this thing go back for reconsideration outside of today's markup, and eager actually to do that, it's because I do not have a preference. I only say that we have to define it one way or the other in this bill, because we don't want to have another repeat under this administration of a First Lady not knowing at a given time, doing a particular job, what the rules are for transparency to the American people.
Let me
yield back to Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, I do that.
Let me just say that we had 4 votes in about 10 minutes. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we move forward with the deliberation. Gentlemen from Cleveland.
I've listened to this discussion, and I'm glad that my friend from California is going to take another look at this. And when you look at it, I hope that you look at it within the context of the historic role of First Ladies. And I think it would be good for this committee to communicate with those who have served in that capacity, to ask them for some guidance about what works and what doesn't work. Because we're talking about the practical application of laws that we make here. You can have a law in theory that in practice is a nightmare. We do not want to diminish the role of a First Lady or, in the future, of a First Man. We do not want to create a circumstance where Mrs. Obama will not be able to fully function in her capacity as the premier representative of the United States. No other than, of course, the President of the United States. We have to be cognizant of the time in which this particular proposal is being offered. It's a time when of enormous change in America, where there's so many people who take great pride in our First Lady, and we have to make sure that we don't do anything to diminish her or to diminish her role. Now, I have great confidence in integrity and in the goodwill of my friend from California. But I would really ask that we have a deep reflection on this before we bring something up that could have consequences that would, I'm sure, be contrary to what we would really want and what the American people would want. The First Lady doesn't belong to this Congress. First Lady don't belong to Congress of the United States. She belongs to America.
Thank you very much. Any other? Let me just say that I don't think we should allow one issue to stop this bill from moving forward. And of course, there's a lot of issues that we have to examine before. And I think that that's an issue that we should have a hearing on. That's an issue that we should have a bill that stands alone. I don't think it should be an amendment. So now I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform for H.R. 1320 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is, are we favorably reporting H.R. 1320 to the House? All those...
Mr. Chairman, a quorum for this committee, although assumed, is not present, so I would move that we do not have a quorum, therefore we can't vote.
We call for a vote, and then, of course, then we'll see in terms of what happens with the vote. So at this time, we will now call for a roll call.
Mr. Towns. Aye. Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Kanjorski. Mrs. Maloney. Mr. Cummings.
Aye.
Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mr. Kucinich.
Aye.
Mr. Kucinich votes aye. Mr. Tierney.
Aye.
Mr. Tierney votes aye. Mr. Clay.
Aye.
Mr. Clay votes aye. Ms. Watson.
Aye.
Ms. Watson votes aye. Mr. Lynch.
Aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Ms. Norton. Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar votes aye. Mr. Hodes?
Aye.
Mr. Hodes votes aye. Mr. Murphy from Connecticut? Mr. Welch? Mr. Foster? Ms. Spear? Mr. Dreehouse?
Aye.
Mr. Dreehouse votes aye. Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Burton? Mr. Burton votes aye. Mr. McHugh?
No.
I'm sorry, but someone said yes. Pardon me. Mr. McHugh? Mr. Micah? Mr. Sauer? Mr. Platts? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Turner? Mr. Westmoreland? Mr. McHenry? Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Flake? Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Schock? On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 12 ayes and 1 nay.
Madam, the committee needs to make certain that you call the roll correctly. Want to make certain that could we have a repeat of the roll call?
I sure can. Mr. Towns?
Aye.
Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Kanjorski? Ms. Maloney?
Aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mr. Kucinich?
Aye.
Mr. Kucinich votes aye. Mr. Tierney?
Aye.
Mr. Tierney votes aye. Mr. Clay?
Aye.
Mr. Clay votes aye. Ms. Watson?
Aye.
Ms. Watson votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Ms. Norton? Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Davis from Illinois? Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Cuellar?
Aye.
Mr. Cuellar votes aye. Mr. Hodes?
Aye.
Mr. Hodes votes aye. Mr. Murphy from Connecticut? Mr. Welch? Mr. Foster? Mr. Dreehouse?
Aye.
Mr. Dreehouse votes aye. Mr. Issa?
I just remember from the water.
You're not recorded.
I think Mr. Murphy will reconsider.
Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Mr. Davis is unrecorded.
Mr. Davis, you're not recorded. Mr. Davis votes aye.
Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Issa, you did.
No.
No. Mr. Burton? Mr. McHugh? Mr. Micah? Mr. Sauer? Mr. Platts? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Turner? Mr. Westmoreland? Mr. McHenry? Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Jordan, Mr. Flake, Mr. Fortenberry, Mr. Chaffetz, Mr. Schock, Mr. Foster, we don't have you recorded. Mr. Foster votes aye.
Report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there are 16 ayes and 1 no.
Motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1320 is ordered reported. I now call on H.R. 1387, Electronic Message Preservation Act, which was introduced by Representative Paul Holmes. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 1387 be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, I yield to the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Hodes, to describe the bill.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for moving this important bill to markup to increase government transparency. I am a strong supporter of transparency and accountability at all levels of government, and that is why I introduced the Electronic Message Preservation Act, a bill to preserve White House records as well as those records of other federal agencies. This legislation passed the House in the last Congress, but was not considered by the Senate. The bill is the product of an investigation conducted by the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. The report of that investigation revealed significant deficiencies in the preservation of email by the White House and other federal agencies. During the Bush administration, numerous White House officials used email accounts maintained by the Republican National Committee, the RNC, which regularly deleted the emails from its servers. Emails sent by White House officials over these RNC accounts included emails concerning official government business. In addition, the Bush White House could not account for hundreds of days' worth of official White House emails sent and received between 2003 and 2005. At the time of these inexplicable losses, the White House used an email archiving system that a former White House information technology officer described as primitive. Other administrations, including President Clinton's, had encountered problems preserving email records. Now, at the beginning of the new administration, with new modes and tools of communication continually deployed, it is critical for Congress to act to ensure that these obstacles to transparency and accountability don't continue. To ensure the retention of these important records, the legislation directs the archivist of the National Archives to establish standards for the capture, management, and preservation of White House emails and other electronic messages, and to certify that the system meets its requirements. The bill also directs the archivist to issue regulations requiring federal agencies to preserve electronic messages in an electronic format. These regulations must cover at a minimum the capture, management, preservation, and electronic retrieval of these electronic records and must be implemented within 4 years of the enactment of the Act. As more and more official business is conducted via electronic mail, Congress must work to ensure that federal agencies have effective practices in place to provide the transparency and accountability to which the citizens of this country are entitled. I urge my colleagues to support this measure and I yield back.
At this time, I yield to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, if I can take this time and offer my amendment at this time, since it's not controversial, then we'll get a final passage. If that's okay, I'll leave it on these statements at the time.
Yes.
Okay, and I have an amendment.
Agenda has amended to this.
I ask unanimous consent to waive the reading.
So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I won't go into reading the details. This is an amendment that's previously been offered and accepted. It was in the past bill last time. My predecessor had offered it. I felt appropriate that it should be in the bill when it leaves here. I think it's non-controversial, and I hope that it be taken in that way, since it is what we voted last time, and we ask it.
I'm prepared to accept the amendment.
And I yield back.
Any other further? Yes.
Permission to enter my statement
Without objection. I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 1387 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1387 to the House. All in favor, say aye. All opposed? Independent of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1387 is ordered reported. The next order of business is 9 postal naming bills and resolutions. I ask unanimous consent that these resolutions be considered in block and as read and open to amendment at any point. The resolutions include H.Res. 178, introduced by Representative Bill Pascal. This measure expresses support for National Brain Injury Awareness Month, which is commemorated annually during the month of March. H.Res. 211, introduced by Representative Lynn Booster. This measure expresses support for the goals, ideas, and history of National Women's History Month, which is commemorated annually during the month of March. H.R. 918, introduced by Representative Brian Higgins. This bill designates a facility of the United States Postal Service in Jamestown, New York, as the Stan Medine Post Office building. H.R. 955, introduced by Representative Jay Inslee. This bill designates a facility of the United States Postal Service in Rolling Bay, Washington, as the John Bud Hawk Post Office. H.R. 987, introduced by Representative Jason Altmeyer. This bill designates a facility of the United States Postal Service in Freedom, Pennsylvania, as